Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. This year we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of this program on Detroit Public Television. I am just the latest in a string of hosts who have brought you important interviews from an African American perspective. Today I am pleased to have two of the former hosts here as my guests. Livonia Perriman hosted Detroit Black Journal and Detroit Black News in the 1970s, and Carl Edwards was a guest host and a frequent guest on the show in the late 1970s. It is a pleasure to have both of you here.
Truly our pleasure, my pleasure.
I feel like both of you could probably just scooch over into this seat and take back over the hosting roles, right? You would be better than I am, right?
Your season, Stephen.
That's right.
Your season now.
Time of the season.
Right.
Livonia, let's start with you. Talk about how you came to host the show and sort of what it was like in the early 70s. This is when the show was pretty new, when you got to sit in the host chair.
I was very honored to sit in the chair. I came behind, believe it or not, Mr. Tony Brown. Tony Brown was called
the original host,
host, and he was called to Washington, D.C., Howard University, to literally be the first chairman of the School of Communication at Howard University. Well, I saw success floating around in Tony Brown, and somebody evidently, I was teaching at the time in the public school, and I was one of the creators of one of the first programs for Black history in the public schools. I didn't know any better. You know, I knew there were people fighting me, but I didn't understand, but didn't listen to them. Right. And this actually happened. I was doing a show for the school system. And someone said, you know, you ought to be in television. Sound like a real...
You ought to be in pictures.
Yeah, right. And so I took them up on it. And I ended up here with such great people, such as George Martin and many others, right after Tony Brown.
Yeah. So talk about some of the things that you were talking about on the show in the 1970s, and whether
this
you
was
see
early,
echoes
and I'm
of
telling on myself in terms of age, but you know, this came right after the '67 riots I actually was on the air, and so that was, you know, it was burning in my heart to have a discussion, and the city was burning, or it was burning to find out where do we go from here. So the show was very integral because it allowed for people who needed a voice to have a voice about what was going on in the lives of people here in Detroit, Michigan. So Black Journal gave people the opportunity to come on the air and express where we were going to go from the '67 riots. So it was very significant, very important. And believe it or not, I don't know about the ratings because, you know, they don't do ratings, I believe, at that time on PBS. Or, you know, who knew? But I knew that there were many people who were very, who were watching and were very pleased that they had an opportunity, or, you know, they were given an opportunity to have a voice. Yeah.
Well, there weren't a lot of opportunities for African Americans to appear on television on shows that they were maybe writing or producing or controlling what the news was.
In fact, there was only one.
So Channel 62, right?
Right, it was right here. And this is now before, I was before 62.
You were before 62.
Right, so this was the only vehicle for people of color, African Americans, to be able to then express themselves. This was the only shop in town at that time. Yeah.
So Carl, before we get to you, we have a clip of you appearing on the 20th anniversary show, so 30 years ago of ABJ. Let's take a look at that.
Carl Edwards, you were also on the tape. See some old friends there?
Oh yeah, yeah. You know, I'm struck by Sam Yet in 1971 approximately said that black people were obsolete and that the political economy of this country basically did not include black people in their plans for the future. The problems of drugs, crack cocaine, unemployment, poverty, homelessness, joblessness, all can be related to that. And I think we got to understand that in terms of as we look to the future. I'm sure and I hope that this program continues to be a forum where we air those views, the connection between political economy and the process of inequality that we experience.
That's pretty deep.
Yes.
For a guy just standing in the audience, you stand up and say that. It's really interesting to look at that clip and think about what was going on then and how appropriate what you're saying there could be right now in 2018.
Yes. Yes. You know, we've literally come full circle. This is my 43rd year as a trial lawyer in Michigan. And prior to becoming a trial lawyer, my first job at 23 years old was, believe it or not, I was the affirmative action director at the Automobile Club of Michigan, and my mission was to racially integrate the salaried ranks of the company. It was 1973 and 1974.
Wow.
And so you can see Detroit really was ground zero for us at the time. We had a mission. We were a generation, Stephen, with a mission. And that mission was to do what we could to make the Constitution and the Bill of Rights relevant for us, to include us. Since the Constitution, the 3/5 clause, Article 2, wrote us out as persons, right? We were non-persons.
You were property.
That's right, we were property.
Right.
And so this idea of that we're inferior simply because of the color of our skin has been a lifelong challenge and quest for me. And we all stand on such great shoulders that came before us.
Yeah, big, broad shoulders.
Yes,
right?
yes.
As you point out, you've been a civil rights attorney my entire life, and I'm not saying that in any sort of disparaging way, but in an honorific way.
Yes.
But talk about the work you did as a guest host here on the show, and how that sort of dovetailed with what you were working on in the law.
We were very fortunate to have this forum because the mainstream media would not cover us. Occasionally, the Detroit Free Press would, but the mainstream media would not cover our issues and would not cover us. And so, you know, as we began to walk into areas as the first, there clearly was a reaction to us.
A pushback.
Huge.
Yes.
I can recall a case I had, and I think there was a sale of a Girl Scout camp, and they thought that Mayor Young was buying the camp. And there was a big meeting of the Girl Scouts out here in northern Oakland County where the Girl Scout camp was located. And they said, as far as we're concerned, you can put all the niggas in Detroit on Belle Isle and blow it up.
Wow.
I mean, that was what we ran into over and over and over, that idea that somehow we just were non-persons.
Yeah, yeah. I assume that you are familiar with the show now.
Oh, yes.
As someone who hosted it in its early time, tell me what you think the significance of it is today, and maybe how different that is than when you were doing it.
In terms of, I was just thinking about it, as you were saying, that we had, it was a mission. I went on the air and privileged and happy to be there because I said, share the stories in the community, to share what was going on in the city, to have an opportunity, and whoever the general manager at that time, he needs to be given, you know, a hands up, because as you know, there was no other place, and for him to, or it was a him, for him to make that decision was a step beyond where we were in the 60s and 70s, and sometime in the 80s. There was no other place. Today, that is still on. The mission is still being carried out by the people such as yourself. And so it is significant today as it was then. Just as you said, he was talking about crack and cocaine. I didn't even know the words back then. I didn't even know there was such a thing back then. But we're talking about it today. So there is a need. It must stay, and it's necessary.
Yeah, yeah. Same question to you, Carl. As an attorney, as former guest host of the show, why do we need this space now?
Tom Wicker, a famous columnist at the New York Times, years ago wrote a book called Tragic Failure. And it's an incredible, searing indictment of the promise of racial integration. This is 1996. And Tom Wicker said the promise of racial integration is dead. And so if he's right and all of the evidence suggests that he is, then this forum is needed now more than ever, because how do we educate those young people? How do we tell them the issues that are going to affect them and their children? I'm a grandfather now, 20 grandchildren, 6 kids. And how do we get that information to them? It's like shows like this, so we can talk about the issues still that when the mainstream media covers them, they're not going to cover them like you're going to cover them, Stephen, or like we covered them when we hosted here. They're just not.
It's different.
It's a different perspective. And it's not that the perspective is wrong, it's just different.
It's different.
That's all. And they got to recognize it's different. So, you know, the problems in Detroit, I was looking at the Time magazine article in 1961. Detroit was in major decline in 61.
In 61.
Yes, and you think about where was the vision of the leaders, the political and economic leaders at the time.
60 years later.
Here we are. Here we are.
Well, I appreciate both of you being here, but I even appreciate more all that you did to make it possible for me to sit here every week.
And it must continue.
Yeah, thank you both.
Struggle continues. Thank you, Stephen.
Pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure.